You've probably heard that in the Middle Ages, people didn't wash, slept sitting up, and believed that the earth was flat. These and many other myths have become firmly entrenched in our minds thanks to books and movies. We think of the Middle Ages as a dark and dirty time, full of ignorance and superstition. But what if these ideas are wrong? What if reality was much more complex and interesting than any fiction? Historical documents, archaeological finds, and scientific research from recent decades have allowed us to take a fresh look at this era. We can refute many long-held misconceptions and show that medieval people were far more educated, inventive, and clean than we tend to think. We are about to debunk the most popular myths that millions still believe in. We will talk about hygiene, architecture, science, and even fashion. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how medieval people built cities that still amaze us with their beauty, how they developed science and art, and how even in the darkest times, the human mind found a way to progress. You will discover that the reality of the Middle Ages was far more interesting than any myth. We are used to thinking that medieval cities were hotbeds of filth and that people did not wash for years. However, this is not the case. Historical documents and archaeological finds prove the opposite. Every self-respecting city, even a small one, had public baths. They were popular with both the nobility and the common people. People regularly visited baths to wash and socialize. Some cities even had bath days when residents gathered together to spend time together. Baths were not just a place to wash, but real centers of social life. They were places where people discussed the news, made deals, and simply spent time together. Moreover, wealthy people had their own baths in their homes. These were small rooms with wooden bathtubs, which were filled with hot water. Of course, they were not accessible to everyone, but this shows that people valued cleanliness and strove for it. The jugs and bowls found by archaeologists, which were used for washing, also indicate that people regularly took care of themselves. The image of medieval unsanitary conditions that is so often portrayed in movies and books is greatly exaggerated. Of course, cities at that time were not as clean as they are today, but that does not mean that people did not care about hygiene. In fact, cleanliness was important, and people took measures to maintain it. In large cities such as London and York, archaeological excavations have uncovered the remains of water pipes that supplied water to homes and public baths. These were, of course, not modern pipes, but rather channels made of stone or wood. But they proved that city authorities cared about cleanliness and tried to provide residents with water. In addition to public baths, people often washed in rivers and lakes, especially during the warmer months. Although this was not always safe due to pollution, it shows that people strove for cleanliness. Houses also had wash basins and basins where servants brought hot water. This was, of course, a privilege of the wealthy, but it shows that personal hygiene was part of their lives. As for soap, it was known and used in the Middle Ages. Historical documents mention soap factories in England that produced soap from animal fats and ash. This soap was not as fragrant and soft as modern soap, but it effectively cleaned the skin and clothes. Another important aspect of hygiene was washing hands and face. Homes had special jugs and bowls for washing. People washed in the morning and before meals, which was an important part of etiquette. Of course, oral hygiene was far from modern, but even for this, people used toothpaste made from herbs and tree bark. It was primitive, but it shows that people cared about their health and appearance. It is also important to note that people washed their clothes. Archaeological finds such as washing basins and soap remnants indicate that this was part of everyday life. Clothing was important not only for protection from the cold, but also for demonstrating social status, so people tried to keep it clean. All of this together debunks the myth of the dirty Middle Ages. People at that time were not ignorant and uncaring about hygiene. On the contrary, they did everything they could to maintain cleanliness in conditions that were far from ideal. They did not have modern technology, but they had ingenuity and a desire for cleanliness that was part of their culture. What part of the body do you think was the dirtiest for medieval people? And what hygiene items do we still use today? Write your guesses in the comments. Many people believe that in the Middle Ages, people believed that the earth was flat. This misconception was popularized in the 19th century to show how far humanity had come since the Dark Ages. In fact, most educated people at the time knew that the earth was spherical. This idea had been known since the time of ancient Greek scientists such as Eratosthenes, who was even able to calculate the circumference of the earth. The idea that medieval people believed the earth was flat is one of the most persistent and enduring myths. It was created in the 19th century when writers and philosophers sought to contrast the dark Middle Ages with the enlightened modern era. But in fact, the idea of the Earth's sphericity never disappeared from Western thought. It was part of the ancient heritage that was preserved and studied in monasteries and universities. As early as the 5th century AD, the scientist and philosopher Macrobius, in his work Commentary on the Dream of Scipio, described the Earth as a sphere divided into climatic zones. This work was very popular in the Middle Ages and was widely read. In the 6th century, Isidore of Seville also wrote about the spherical shape of the Earth. His etymologies became a kind of encyclopedia of the time and were required reading in monastic schools. In this work, Isidore described the Earth as a sphere, which indicates that this idea was widespread among educated people. In the 11th and 12th centuries, when the first universities began to appear in Europe, astronomy and geography became important disciplines. In their lectures, scientists drew on the works of ancient Greek and Arab thinkers who had no doubt about the spherical shape of the Earth. They used observations of the stars, eclipses, and even how ships disappear over the horizon to prove that the Earth is round. The famous Italian poet Dante Alighieri, in his Divine Comedy, 14th century, described the Earth as a sphere, with Satan at the center of hell. He also wrote that people living on the other side of the Earth walk upside down. This work was very popular and was read even by ordinary people, which suggests that the idea of the Earth being spherical was widespread. So where did this myth come from? It was created in the 19th century when writers and historians such as Washington Irving described Columbus in their works as a brave man who challenged the dogmas of the church, which believed in a flat Earth. It was a beautiful story that fit well with the concept of the conflict between science and religion. In reality, Columbus did not argue that the Earth was round, but rather that it was much smaller than his contemporaries believed, and that it was therefore possible to reach India by sailing west. The church did not forbid belief in the spherical shape of the Earth. On the contrary, many church leaders were scientists and supported this idea. The myth that the Inquisition burned people for believing in a round Earth is also false. This would have been simply absurd since the church itself knew that the Earth was round. Thus, the myth of a flat Earth is essentially a historical hoax that was created to discredit the Middle Ages. In reality, important discoveries were made in astronomy and geography during that era, and people with sufficient education knew perfectly well that our planet is spherical. Why do you think the myth of a flat Earth has become so ingrained in our minds if it was disproved in the Middle Ages? Perhaps it was because medieval people were illiterate, or maybe there was another reason. We will find out very soon. It is widely believed that in the Middle Ages, people were completely illiterate and only monks knew how to read and write. This is far from the truth. Although literacy rates were not as high as they are today, they were much higher than we think. Of course, most peasants could neither read nor write, but literacy was quite widespread among townspeople, merchants, and craftsmen. The idea of total illiteracy in the Middle Ages is one of the most persistent misconceptions. In fact, this era was a time of flourishing education and the development of written culture. Literacy was, of course, unevenly distributed across different social classes, but it was not the preserve of monks and the clergy. In cities which were becoming centers of trade and crafts, literacy was a necessity. Traders and merchants had to keep their accounts, record transactions, and communicate with partners from other cities and countries. Tablet inscriptions and fragments of letters found by archaeologists show that people actively used writing in their daily lives. These were not just beautiful words, but a practical tool for doing business. In addition, there were guilds of craftsmen in cities, which also needed literate people. Masters had to write down their recipes, draw up contracts, and train their apprentices. Thus, literacy was not only a privilege, but also a professional necessity. The development of universities, which were founded in the 12th and 13th centuries, was a real breakthrough. Thousands of students studied in Oxford, Cambridge, and other cities. These universities became centers of science, where not only theology but also law, medicine, astronomy, and other sciences were studied. Students read books, wrote essays, and took exams. This proves that there was a developed education system in the Middle Ages. It is important to note that books in the Middle Ages were very expensive, but that did not mean that they were not read. Books were copied by hand, but they were available in monastery and university libraries. People also gathered together to read books aloud, which was a form of entertainment and education. In addition, the first printed books appeared in the Middle Ages, albeit very primitive ones, which made knowledge more accessible. These were, of course, not modern books, but rather brochures and leaflets. But they played an important role in the dissemination of information. Literacy levels depended not only on social class, but also on gender. Women were generally less literate than men, but there were exceptions. Noble women could read and write, and some even wrote books and letters. For example, Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine was a highly educated woman who patronized the arts and sciences. Nuns were also literate, as it was part of their duties. This shows that literacy was not the preserve of men. The emergence of vernacular languages in literature also contributed to the spread of literacy. Whereas books had previously been written mainly in Latin, in the late Middle Ages, works began to appear in English, French, and German. This made reading accessible to a wider range of people who did not know Latin. Thus, the myth of total illiteracy in the Middle Ages does not correspond to reality. Of course, the majority of the population was illiterate, but in cities there was a developed written culture and education system that allowed people to learn and develop. It was a time when people sought knowledge and used it to improve their lives. Many people think that in the Middle Ages, everyone except the nobility was poor and lived from hand to mouth. In fact, this was not the case. Life was hard, but people did not starve constantly. Yes, there were periods of famine, but these were caused by crop failures or wars, not chronic poverty. In normal years, people ate a fairly varied diet. This is evidenced by archaeological finds, which we talked about in previous videos. People grew grains, vegetables, and fruits, and also raised livestock. Fish and game were also part of their diet. The idea of total poverty and constant hunger in the Middle Ages is largely an exaggeration. Although life was certainly hard and no one was immune to crop failures, people did not live on the brink of starvation. Archaeological finds and historical documents confirm that in normal years, the diet was quite varied. The basis of the diet was grains, barley, rye, and oats. These were used to bake bread and make porridge and soups. But in addition to grains, people actively used other foods. For example, vegetables were an important part of the diet. Cabbage, onions, garlic, beans, and peas were grown in gardens. These vegetables were not only a source of vitamins, but also helped to diversify the diet. Remains of seeds and plants found by archaeologists indicate that people knew how to grow and store vegetables. As for meat, its consumption depended on social status. Noble people ate a lot of meat, including game caught while hunting. Ordinary people ate meat much less often, but they were not completely deprived of it. People raised pigs, chickens, geese, and cows. Pork was especially popular because pigs were easy to keep. Meat was smoked or salted to preserve it for many months. Fish was also an important part of the diet, especially on fasting days when the church forbade the eating of meat. In England, where there are many rivers and lakes, people fished and ate fish fresh or smoked. Archaeological finds such as fish bones and hooks confirm this. In coastal areas, people also ate seafood, oysters, mussels, and crabs. In addition, people gathered wild herbs, berries, and mushrooms, which helped to diversify their diet and served as a source of vitamins. For example, wild strawberries, blueberries, and raspberries were gathered in the forests. All this made the diet more nutritious and interesting. Thus, the myth of total poverty and hunger does not correspond to reality. Life was difficult, but people were resourceful and inventive. They used all the resources available to them to feed themselves and their families. Of course, there were periods of famine, but these were caused not by poverty, but by factors such as crop failure, drought, or war, which could have catastrophic consequences. But in normal times, people lived full lives. Now we know what a medieval peasant ate for dinner. Now imagine what he wore while doing so. Most likely it was very colorful. Why? Keep watching this video to find out the answer to that question. We imagine medieval clothing as rough, dark, and monotonous outfits. This is also not true. People loved bright colors, and their clothing was much more varied and sophisticated than we can imagine. The remains of fabrics and dyes found indicate that people used a wide range of colors, from red and blue to green and yellow. Clothing was an indicator of social status. Noble people wore clothes made of expensive fabrics, such as silk and velvet, and decorated them with embroidery and precious stones. Ordinary people wore clothes made of wool and linen, but these were also dyed and decorated. The idea of dark and dreary medieval fashion is largely a result of what we see in movies and paintings, which often focus on the darker aspects of the era. In reality, medieval people loved bright and rich colors, and their clothing was a true work of art. Archaeological finds related to clothing are extremely rare, but the remains of dyes, buckles, and buttons allow us to reconstruct the picture. For example, the remains of dyes used to dye fabrics have been found at excavations. These were plant dyes made from tree bark, berries, and herbs, which produced very bright colors. Red was obtained from madder roots, blue from indigo, and green from buckthorn berries. These dyes were expensive, and their presence indicated the wealth of the owner. Clothing was an important indicator of social status. Noble people wore clothes made from expensive fabrics such as silk, velvet, and brocade, which were imported from other countries. These fabrics were not only beautiful, but also very soft and pleasant to the touch. Clothes were decorated with embroidery, gold thread, and precious stones. The more decorations there were on the clothes, the higher the status of the owner. Ordinary people wore clothes made of cheaper fabrics, such as wool and linen. But that does not mean that their clothes were monotonous. Wool came in different varieties, from coarse to fine, and linen was light and airy, making it ideal for summer clothing. Clothes were dyed in simpler but still bright colors that were available. The cut of the clothes was also varied. Men wore tunics and trousers, while women wore long-sleeve dresses and headdresses. Fashion changed over time, and different styles were popular in different eras. For example, long, narrow dresses were popular in the 12th century, while looser, more voluminous dresses were popular in the 14th century. Headwear was an important part of clothing. Men wore hats and hoods, while women wore scarves and bonnets. In some regions, tall headwear was popular, which made a person appear taller. All of this together dispels the myth of dark and dreary medieval fashion. People of that time loved bright colors and sought beauty. Their clothing was a reflection of their status, taste, and personality. It was an entire industry that included craftsmen, merchants, and dyers who worked together to create this beauty. And it is only thanks to archaeology that we can truly appreciate how diverse and vibrant medieval fashion was. Footwear also played an important role. Archaeological excavations in London have uncovered many leather shoes decorated with embroidery and patterns. They were made to be not only comfortable, but also beautiful. Men and women wore shoes with pointed toes, which were very popular in the 14th century. The longer the toe, the higher the status of the owner. Leather belts decorated with buckles made of various metals from simple to richly decorated were also popular in the Middle Ages. This was another opportunity to demonstrate one's status. The outfits of noble people often emphasized their luxurious lifestyle. They could be made of several layers of fabric, which made them voluminous and warm. In addition, embroidery was often present on clothing, depicting family crests and symbols. This was another way to show one's origin and status. The clothes of ordinary people were more functional and practical. They were made for work and had to be durable. However, even on such clothing, small decorations could be found, such as embroidery along the edges of the sleeves or colored laces. This shows that people sought beauty even if they could not afford expensive fabrics. It is believed that armor was so heavy and uncomfortable that knights could not move in it. This is a myth. Armor was a very complex structure consisting of many interconnected elements. It was designed to distribute weight throughout the body and not restrict movement. Knights could run, jump, and even mount a horse while fully armored. The weight of the armor was distributed so as not to put excessive strain on any one part of the body. Keep this in mind the next time you see a knight struggling to walk across a battlefield. The idea of knightly armor as cumbersome and heavy equipment that was difficult to move around in is one of the most popular, but also one of the most inaccurate myths. Of course, armor was heavy, but it was designed with human anatomy and mobility in mind. Armor was not a monolithic piece of metal, but consisted of many articulated plates that were attached to a leather or fabric base. Each plate was carefully fitted and fastened to the adjacent ones with bolts, rivets, and leather straps. This allowed the knight to freely bend his arms and legs, turn his head, and even sit on a horse. The weight of a full set of armor was about 25–30 kilograms, which is not much more than the equipment of a modern soldier. Weight distribution was a key factor. Instead of carrying all the weight on the shoulders like a backpack, the armor distributed it throughout the body. The leggings were attached to the belt and the breastplate to the shoulders. This way, the load was evenly distributed and the knight could move relatively freely. To test this, modern researchers and reenactors conduct experiments. They put on accurate replicas of medieval armor and perform various exercises: running, jumping, somersaulting, and even climbing stairs. The results show that a knight in armor was very mobile. Of course, this required physical training, but it was not an impossible task. Another important element was the undergarment. It was a quilted jacket worn under the armor. It served as a shock absorber and protected the body from friction and blows. The undergarment was very important and was worn by all knights. The myth of uncomfortable armor was popularized in the 19th century when armor became part of collections and exhibitions. Immobile mannequins in museums gave the impression that armor was bulky and clumsy, but in fact, it was the most modern protective equipment of its time, allowing knights to survive on the battlefield. Thus, armor was not only a symbol of power and status, but also a high-tech product that required great skill from the blacksmith. Each plate was made by hand, and it took months to make a single set. It was an expensive pleasure that only the wealthiest knights could afford. If a knight could move easily in his armor, how do you think he managed to build such primitive houses? Let's not jump to conclusions, but rather take a closer look. Stay tuned. We often think that medieval houses were primitive and uncomfortable. This is a misconception. Medieval architects were true geniuses. They built magnificent castles, cathedrals, and bridges that still amaze us with their grandeur. These structures were not only beautiful, but also very practical. Architects knew how to use natural materials to make buildings strong and warm. The idea of medieval architecture as something primitive and crude is one of the most unfair myths about this era. Of course, most peasant houses were simple, but that does not mean that architects and builders did not have deep knowledge and skills. On the contrary, they were true masters of their craft, and their creations are still admired today. Medieval cathedrals are not just beautiful buildings. They are true architectural masterpieces that were built according to the laws of physics and engineering. Gothic cathedrals, with their high arches and huge windows, were built using buttresses and flying buttresses, which helped distribute the weight and prevent collapse. These architectural elements were not just decorations, but played a key role in the strength and stability of the building. Builders at that time did not have computers or software for calculations, but they had a deep understanding of mechanics and materials that was passed down from generation to generation. As for houses, they were not only simple but also practical. In northern countries where winters were cold, houses were built from thick logs or stone, which retained heat well. In warmer regions, wood and clay were used, which were also effective. Houses had fireplaces and hearths, which were not only used for cooking, but also for heating the room. Smoke from the fire escaped through special openings in the roof, which helped to prevent suffocation. Heating in the homes of the nobility was more complex. Some castles and manors used hypocaust systems, which were similar to those used in ancient Rome. Hot air from the furnace was fed under the floor and into the walls, creating a warm and comfortable climate. Of course, this was expensive and only available to the wealthy, but it shows that people sought comfort and had the knowledge to create such systems. In addition to buildings, medieval architects and engineers built bridges and roads. These structures were very strong and could withstand the weight of heavy carts and wagons. The remains of stone bridges that have been found indicate that builders knew how to work with this material and how to make strong structures. Construction was a highly organized process. Master builders, masons, carpenters, and other craftsmen worked together to create these masterpieces. They used simple but effective tools: hammers, chisels, saws, and plumb lines. Knowledge was passed down from master to apprentice, and this was the foundation of the entire system. There were also building regulations in cities. The authorities established rules that had to be followed when constructing houses. For example, some cities had laws that prohibited the construction of wooden houses next to stone ones to prevent the spread of fires. This shows that people were aware of the risks and took measures to make their cities safer. Thus, the myth of primitive architecture is not true. The Middle Ages were a time of great architectural achievements. People did not just build houses and castles, they created masterpieces that still stand today and continue to amaze us. Their knowledge and skills were the result of centuries of experience and experimentation. And it is only thanks to these creations that we can truly appreciate the genius of medieval architects and builders. In books and films, the Middle Ages are often portrayed as a time when dark and impenetrable forests were everywhere. This was not the case. Forests played an important role in people's lives, and they were not as wild as we imagine. People actively used them for hunting, gathering berries and mushrooms, and harvesting wood. Finds related to forestry show that people managed forests to provide themselves with everything they needed. They cut down trees for construction and heating, but did so wisely so as not to destroy the forest. The idea of medieval forests as wild and impenetrable wildernesses, home to bandits and mythical monsters, is mostly literary fiction. Although there were certainly remote areas, most forests were an important resource that was carefully managed and used. In fact, forests were divided into different categories. There were royal forests, where hunting was the privilege of the king and the nobility. There were communal forests, where anyone could gather mushrooms, berries, and firewood. And there were private forests that belonged to the nobility or the church. This division shows that the forest was not just a wild territory, but was part of the social and economic structure of society. People used the forest not only for hunting and gathering. Wood was the main building material. It was used to build houses, ships, furniture, and tools. Logging was strictly regulated. Special officials called foresters ensured that trees were cut down in certain quantities and at certain times. This was done so that the forest could regenerate and provide for future generations. In addition to wood, the forest provided people with many other resources. Pigs were grazed there and fed on acorns. This was an important source of meat. Firewood was also collected in the forest, which was essential for heating and cooking. The remains of charcoal kilns found by archaeologists indicate that people produced charcoal, which was used for blacksmithing. Forests were also a source of medicinal herbs. People knew which plants had healing properties and used them for treatment. Monasteries had special gardens where herbs were grown, but most people gathered them in the forest. Animals that lived in the forest were an important source of food. Hunting was a popular activity, and people hunted deer, hares, wild boars, and other game. Hunting was not only a source of food, but also entertainment for the nobility. Thus, the myth of dark and wild forests is essentially a romanticized notion. In reality, forests were part of a civilized world that was carefully managed and utilized. People lived in harmony with nature and understood that it was the source of their survival. They knew how to use its resources without destroying them. It was a complex and intelligent approach that allowed them to survive in conditions that were far from ideal. Medieval medicine is believed to have been primitive and dangerous. Of course, it was far from modern, but doctors of that time were much more knowledgeable than we think. They based their knowledge on the works of ancient Greek and Arab scholars, which had been translated into Latin. Medicine was studied at universities, and doctors possessed knowledge that enabled them to treat diseases and perform operations. The idea of medieval medicine as a primitive and dangerous system based on superstition and incompetence is one of the most persistent and unfair myths. In reality, Medicine during this period was a complex and evolving science based on knowledge accumulated over thousands of years. Doctors of the time certainly did not have access to modern technology, but they possessed a deep knowledge of anatomy and physiology. They studied the works of ancient Greek physicians, such as Hippocrates and Galen, as well as Arab scholars who were leaders in medicine at the time. These works were translated into Latin and widely studied in universities. One important aspect of medieval medicine was surgery. Surgeons, unlike doctors, did not always have a university education, but they were very skilled in their work. Archaeological finds such as surgical instruments, knives, tweezers, saws, show that surgeons were able to perform complex operations, including amputations, bone setting, and fracture treatment. Analysis of skeletons, which we discussed in previous chapters, has shown that many people who suffered fractures survived, suggesting that surgical care was effective. Knowledge of pharmacology was also well developed in the Middle Ages. Medicinal herbs were grown and collected in monasteries and pharmacies, from which ointments, tinctures, and powders were made. These remedies were used to treat various illnesses, from colds to serious diseases. Medical books of the time contained detailed descriptions of herbs and their healing properties. Dental medicine was also well developed. Healers of that time could remove teeth and treat abscesses. Of course, it was painful, but it helped people cope with their problems. Remains of toothpaste made from herbs and tree bark found by archaeologists also indicate that people took care of their teeth. An important aspect of medieval medicine was therapy. Doctors used diet, exercise, and herbs to treat illnesses. They understood that a person's health depended not only on treatment, but also on lifestyle. They also believed in the theory of humors, which said that illnesses were caused by an imbalance in the body. This theory was, of course, wrong, but it was the basis for treatment and diagnosis. Thus, the myth of dark medicine is not true. Medieval doctors were literate and experienced professionals who possessed deep knowledge and skills. They did everything possible to help their patients using the means available to them. It was only thanks to their efforts that people were able to survive in conditions that were far from ideal. We imagine that all knights lived in magnificent castles, but this is not the case. Castles were very expensive to build and maintain. Most knights lived in manors, which were not as large but were very comfortable. Castles were only used in case of danger. Finds related to life in castles show that life there was not so luxurious. They were cold and damp. Life in manors was much more comfortable. The idea of life in castles as something luxurious and comfortable is one of the most common myths. Movies and literature have created an image where knights and nobles live in luxurious chambers, with servants waiting on their every need. However, the reality was much harsher. Castles were primarily military structures, and their design was focused on defense rather than comfort. Building a castle was a very expensive and labor-intensive process that could take decades. It required huge financial investments in a large number of workers. After construction, the castle also required constant maintenance. Walls had to be repaired, moats cleaned, and gates and drawbridges kept in working order. This was expensive, and not every knight could afford such luxury. Therefore, most knights lived in manors, which were much more practical and comfortable for living. A manor was an estate consisting of a main house, barns, stables, and vegetable gardens. Unlike a castle, which was built of stone, a manor was built of wood and clay, which made it warmer and more comfortable. Life in a castle was not very pleasant. The walls were thick, which made the rooms dark and damp. The windows were small to protect against enemies, which made the rooms gloomy. Heating was a problem. There were fireplaces in the rooms, but they could not completely heat the large rooms. In winter, it was very cold in castles. Castles were mainly used as defensive structures. During wars and uprisings, the nobility and local population took refuge behind their walls. In peacetime, castles were centers of government, where knights received vassals and judged disputes. But living there permanently was uncomfortable. The kitchen was another problem. It was located in a separate building or in the basement to prevent fires. Food was cooked over an open fire, and smoke often filled the room. Servants carried food along long corridors, and by the time it reached the table, it was already cold. Finds related to life in castles show that there was no particular luxury there. The furniture was simple, and the tableware was rough. It was a functional place, not a place for comfortable living. Thus, the myth of life in castles is a romanticized notion that does not correspond to reality. Life in castles was harsh and uncomfortable. Most knights lived in manors, which were much more comfortable places to live. Castles were symbols of power and protection, but not places for everyday life. We have examined the most popular myths about the Middle Ages and found that many of them have nothing to do with reality. Archaeology and historical documents have helped us recreate a more accurate and complete picture of this era. We have come to understand that people were cleaner, more educated, and more inventive than we thought. All these myths, as it turned out, were created much later than the era itself. They became part of the cultural heritage that we pass on from generation to generation without thinking about their veracity. This shows that history is not just a set of facts, but a constant process of rethinking and searching for the truth. Our task is not to take things at face value, but to always look for evidence. What other myths about the Middle Ages do you know? Suggest topics for our future videos in the comments. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our new releases.